We are individuals and members of the groups of people that comprise our organizations, businesses, associations, counties, and countries. When in these forms, we sometimes falter, make a poor decision, follow someone who should not be followed, let things happen without fighting for what we know to be right. In these forms, our performance varies. But at a distance and across time, watch out. As Vernice Armour, America's first woman combat helicopter pilot, the Fly Girl, says, you can't see the picture if you're in it. So let's step out, step back from the frame, and see the whole picture, and more importantly, our place in it in a whole new way. From back here, it's clear that our species has earned a pretty impressive report card. Species Prime Directive number 1, procreate. Human species grade, A+. Our numbers are great and growing. So much so that the Earth now supports more people than ever existed at the same time, ever. While the rate of population growth is on the decline, from back here, our success is clear. If you were to make a graph of total human population from 10,000 BCE to about 1750, all you'd have to do is draw a horizontal line. A line that remained largely unchanged for nearly 12,000 years. Then, after 120 centuries, or 1,200 decades, or 4,380,000 days of nothing much, something miraculous happened. A few hundred years ago, that boring old population line went from flat to feisty. Not merely curving upward, but lunging vertically, screaming the story of our species' success. For every man, woman, and child alive just 100 years ago, 4 people now stand in their place. Now, that's not to say that more is better or that population management isn't a necessary concern, but from a pure species perspective, it's a key performance indicator, and we nailed it. Not only are there more of us, we are smarter than we've ever been. In 2020, 90.1% of the adult Americans 25 and over had completed high school, which represents a 350% increase over the numbers earning similar degrees back in 1920. We enjoy a global economy and instant communication. We've built and operate more organizations and institutions than ever before, and the demand curve for leadership has gone vertical. The world needs leaders. Within you is the heart of a leader. The question is, are you willing to win? If you're willing to think different, willing to work different, willing to change at the speed of now, then you're willing to win. Welcome to Willing to Win. I'm Jeff Kaplan.
And I'm Tara Thomas-Gettman. Thanks so much for staying with us as we take a really hard look at leadership, because some of these questions are hard ones to consider because it might change your life.
Yeah, I tell you, there is such a need for leaders, and organizations continue to try to grapple with not only, what leadership is, but how to develop leaders. We've done a study, and you've seen some of the work on that, where we estimate that it could be upwards of $150 billion. Think about that a second. $150 billion a year organizations spend on leadership development, right? To put it in perspective, if an economy, like a company, a country, had an economy that was $150 billion a year, that would rank it as the 51st largest economy in the world. That's huge, right? The problem is we don't know if it's doing any good. Mm-hmm. We don't know if we're actually developing leaders because, as Alyssa will show us in one of our next episodes, there are 4.5 trillion definitions of leadership, and she's going to go through each one for us, as she's promised. And the thing is, if you have a different view of what leadership is, or you need different leadership capabilities because of the contextual situation that your organization is in, then how do you adjust what it is you're training for and what it is you're testing for, what are you trying to develop? Our research is a little different. A few years ago, we did research into leadership, but we did it in a different way. And the conclusion was that organizations have all the leadership they could ever need already inside the organization. What they don't have is the ability to give permissions and set up a structure where people can exercise it. So it's almost like you can't handle, like, or you can't handle the truth from that Jack Nicholson.
Yes, from A Few Good Men with Tom Hanks or Tom Cruise, yes.
You can't handle the leadership that you already have in your organization. So instead, what do? We spend our way out of it, and there's $150 billion out there that we're not really sure is yielding the kind of return we'd like to see.
We know that it's not when we look at some of the indicators. So in the last couple months, just since 2022 commenced, some of our research has uncovered that there have been 35,700 new peer-reviewed articles specifically on the topic of leadership that have emerged in just the past 2 months. So what does that tell us? That not only is your assessment correct, that the billions of dollars may not be yielding the results, but people are starved for some kind of guidance or some kind of reassurance that yes, post-COVID, I'm riding the ship of this organization in a way that's going to be productive, and hopefully many people would like to say, return to pre-pandemic levels. But as you've so aptly put it, there is no pendulum swinging back entirely because we are never going back. In some ways, we've discovered by default that the ways of working pre-COVID were not necessarily the most effective. And in terms of our leadership styles, maybe those employees aren't going to stick around if we don't change our ways.
Absolutely. I think the first thing we have to do is get that 37,000 articles to Alyssa and make sure she goes
in her spare time
and adds that to her 4 billion. But really that is the challenge that folks face, and that is, how do we understand what leadership is? What is this formula for success? And so if you just take a step back and you think about the topics we're covering and what we're talking about, maybe you can start to see the formula come together. The idea is this, that change is on the horizon. If you look off into the future, whether it's a month down the line, a year down the line, or 10 years down the line, what you're going to see is a completely different world that's starting to peek out and show itself at the edges on the horizon. And what we have to do is we have to figure out which of those changes is actually going to be the one that survives to make it to now. So when we get to the future and that future is now, what's going to be there? And then how do we position our organization to best take advantage of those new environmental circumstances? So this whole idea about leadership is absolutely integrated with everything we've talked about with change, because leadership is the answer to change. How are we going to deal with something that's never happened before? How are we going to deal with circumstances we've never had to face, that nobody's had to face? And how are we going to do so on a scale that would be, unthinkable to our species even 100 years ago? That's why there's such a need for leadership, because we're not playing. I mean, when this comes, we still have to produce. We have to produce food. We have to educate, our communities. We have to provide social and communication infrastructure. We have to have transportation infrastructure. There is a lot of work that is not going to stop. The need for it is not going to stop while we stop to figure out, does this leadership model apply at this organization on this day? We got to go.
Oh, absolutely. It's great points, because when we think about how looking forward, perhaps people are, just as these peer-reviewed articles would show us or tell us, they're looking for answers. But as a history buff, you know that many of the life lessons really reside in our past, and we can draw from some of these examples to inform us to be more effective moving forward. Case in point, we looked at some research. A failure-tolerant leader was a concept that really emerged in the early 2000s as being maybe a different approach, right? Because now all of a sudden, like, you're giving me permission to fail, whereas before it was, you better not fail me. When I hire you, I'm trusting you to not fail the organization. But in fact, research tells us, if we look at path-breaking leaders, Thomas Edison, GM's Charles Kettering, the Watsons with IBM, 3M's William McKnight, all of them, turns out, were famous for having this commonality about not only tolerating failure, but the reason people felt they had permission or a comfort level to be innovative and take the risks is because they were known to be the kind of people that would schmooze with the employees, build relationships with them, have a level of trust that their team was willing to take a risk. And I thought that was so cool to sort of uncover. But in fact, this isn't some new concept or idea. This has been around for decades. We just need to look at history to sort of
Absolutely.
Uncover that nugget.
And when you think back, on it, and you think about, leaders that you've known and so forth, and then you think about the leadership theories that we're now uncovering that say that we need to show, more of ourselves. The reality is, I think we've always known that nobody's perfect, right? And yet we idealize our leaders,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Idealized leadership is one of the components to one of the leadership theories called the Transformational leadership theory. And idealized leadership is, on the one hand, showing the way, but the belief that somebody is, can't make a mistake, always gets it right, is just impractical, because in life, nothing ever ends up that way. So I think that we're starting to say, hey, that's an assumption that the best amongst us somehow don't fail. That we know that that's not true. I don't know if you've ever seen the Michael Jordan video where he talks about the thousands of shots that he missed, the dozens of games that he lost when he had the final shot and was unable to make the final shot. All of those built him to his legendary status. But in the reality of building the greatest basketball career in the history of the NBA, it is littered with setbacks and trials, right? So to be able to see that, right, is absolutely key. And then you also are talking about the idea that, we're just needing to make sure that leaders interact with the folks that follow them, as people interact, right? Just talking to them, showing part of, who you are, finding out about the people that work for you. We do a lot of work with Jerry Akers and his family and his wife, who's the chief hugs officer at their organization, knows everybody's name and background. And they used to call this, Tom Peters used to call this, and it was a breakthrough concept 30 or 40 years ago. It was called management by walking around, making sure that you get out on the plant floor. But it wasn't just Tom Peters that actually created that. In the book on DuPont, which was a book I read on the history of DuPont, the man that has the most number of patents, I think, in history, something like 2,500, and I could be off on those numbers. But the bottom line is their most prolific patent writer in DuPont's history, which has a history of innovation, was somebody who never had an office in 45 years because he wanted to be out there talking to folks. And so I think we're just galvanizing now these best practices of bold leaders who really cut through all the formality that said you should act this way, your employees are over here, you're over here, they can't be working unless you're seeing them at the desk working. Cut through all of that stuff and started acting as they were and started treating people like they would want to be treated, which takes us back even further to this thing I know: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's a pretty good
golden rule.
Pretty good.
Yeah, right? I mean, all these years later, we know that still matters to people at our core. We still want that sort of equal treatment and acceptance. And the difference now as we evolve into this more remote and hybrid workspace is you can't walk the halls if the halls don't exist. So there is a unique challenge put forth for leaders and HR executives everywhere. And when we come back, we caught up with somebody who's leading the charge to sort of break the mold of HR and how she's been doing it effectively across tech companies for the past 2 decades.
She is amazing.
Don't go anywhere.
Willing to win.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm Tara Thomas-Gettman.
And I'm Jeff Kaplan. Tara, I was thinking about some of the stuff that you're talking about. And, a lot of it just comes down to common sense, right?
Yes.
We need leaders who are much like the people in our families that we trust and respect. And we have to do that. We have to do that, at scale. And it really means that we've got to do a lot of thinking about how we develop people in organizations, because having a leadership development program or doing an annual assessment, those kinds of things are interactions with an employee. They can feel very much like a parent is sitting you down and telling you what to do. It can be very demoralizing, and it can also keep people in their spot rather than encourage them to break out on their own and learn new things.
Oh, 100%. And we are fortunate that Willing to Win has caught up with somebody who is an influencer, progressive in her space in the industry in terms of how she has supported managing people in a way that, as Jeff said, empowers them to not only believe in the mission of the organization, but to really toss the traditional HR concept aside and embrace a new way of working. Colleen Mccreary is her name. She's currently with Credit Karma as the Chief People, Publicity, and People, Places, and Publicity Officer. In her past 20 years, she's worked with startups, including Microsoft years ago, as well as some other interesting companies to help lead the charge for effectively engaging with people. Let's hear from her.
Well, it's so exciting to have you join us and just talk about your journey. How did you come to be a chief people officer and really be at the forefront of that whole role that so many companies are now embracing?
Well, it's interesting because I started my career professionally in college recruiting. So I ended up at a tech company in the 90s. I like to date myself a little bit there. And that was a very serendipitous. In college, I had worked with a high school math program, basically like the social coordinator, essentially. And I stayed in touch with a lot of the counselors from that program who were all like master's and PhD students in math. And I thought I was going to go into this career in academia. I had done my master's work on the retention of women in engineering and computer science programs. And I was visiting Stanford University, and one of those counselors was there finishing his PhD in math. And he said, I think you're wasting your time. I think you'd be really good at a tech company. You were really great with all of us and connecting with us and always really curious about what we were doing. And he introduced me to some friends who happened to be at another tech company. Actually, it was known as Netscape at the time, which had the first browser. I didn't really know I was even being interviewed. And, after a few coffees, they offered me a job. I ended up turning down that job because at the time I was living in Seattle. And I bumped into somebody else who said, oh, we do this thing. We do this college recruiting thing you talked to Netscape about. We do that at Microsoft. You should come do that for us. And within like 2 weeks, I had a job offer from them and I decided to take it. And I spent, the first probably 10 years of my career really focused on this idea of, going out to college campuses and finding great talent and recruiting them and convincing them of the story of why that would be, a great fit for them to come work at either at Microsoft or at Electronic Arts, EA, the video game company. And also saying to some kids like, yeah, this isn't going to be a great job for you, which was always a really good strength of mine, I think. I was willing to tell people sometimes what they didn't want to hear. And, but I always thought of HR as like this, like rules and process and saying no all the time and just all the things that I just could not imagine were interesting. And I actually had a skip level conversation with the woman who was the chief human resources officer at the job at the time at EA, who said like, I actually think you would really like this. Like, I think that you have the right temperament. And she offered me what would be a promotion. I'd be reporting to her.
So when it comes to managing people, clearly each company has a unique approach to that. But ultimately, how are you helping guide the role in your case now with an HR lens, but valuing the relationships and the people much more than perhaps the traditional approach to HR that didn't really interest you initially?
Right. I think that's a great question because a lot of times people will talk about, it's interesting to me because they talk about if I just have enough training, if I just have enough classes, I'll be a better manager. And what we found, what I found over the years, is a lot of times you actually pattern match what you've seen and experienced, and that's how you become a manager much more than sort of training and classes. And so I think it's really important that not just my role, but every leader that you have at the company is modeling the behavior as a manager. And so it means that they're doing the exact same things that we ask every manager, having regular one-on-ones. Are they having clear conversations? Are they setting the right expectations? And are they making their employees feel valued? Which I think is really the context of the conversation we're hearing a lot over the last couple of years, which is people sort of recognizing for themselves what's important and then finally articulating it either by, expressing that to their managers and asking for something, maybe sometimes for the first time, or just by leaving and going somewhere else and looking for it in that way. And I oftentimes say that managing people is a lot like having a baby, because if you've ever had a child, and especially that first baby, you read all these books and you're like, go to all these classes. And then the baby comes out and it's like nothing like the book or the classes. And it's because every single human has their own unique operating system and they're going to operate a little bit differently. And it's that experience of going through that as a parent that is very similar to being a manager, where that experience of going through the journey and learning, and you just have to try. And so we, at most of the companies I've been at, we certainly have invested a lot. I've been in the technology industry for 25 years. And in that world, we've had a great resignation every single day for 25 years. There's nothing about that's going on right now that has not been an issue. People in that industry have had a lot of choices and could exercise those choices. And so taking care of your employees has always been sort of at the forefront.
Clearly, your execution of your role has been at such a level of success that it led, HBO and powers that be in Hollywood to model a character after you in a show, in a series. So talk about how that all came to be and a little bit about the Colleen character on camera.
Oh, that was a crazy adventure. I had never had anything to do with TV or film, or I knew nothing about that process. Even in college studying communications, I think that might have been, maybe an intro class where they mentioned those things, but I never really had anything to do with it. And a friend of mine, one of the things about Silicon Valley as a TV show, and the reason I think it's so funny, is because it is so real that they use all of these people who are in these jobs and in these roles, and they actually bring them into the writer's room. And a friend of mine had been brought in as a full-time writer, content person, producer, who had been somebody I had hired early in his career right out of college, and then had stayed in touch with. And then he had become a venture capitalist, which meant that he was funding companies. So he was seeing a lot of startups. And for this last season, they were going to really go in on, this is a real company now and what happens. And I guess they had said like, hey, we're going to need an HR person. Do you know anybody who does that? And he's like, I know exactly the person who does that. And so I didn't realize that they were building a character around me. That was the one nuance that did not come out until much later. But I spent, 4 hours with 20 writers at the very beginning. They were asking me all these questions. How do things work? What are some crazy things? And I had lived through crazy startups. So that show to me actually used to be painful. Like I would watch it and just be like, oh my God, something I've done is going to end up on here. The woman, Tracy, who's the HR person who they've sort of modeled after me. I never got to meet her, but I got to meet most of the cast and go to the set, and it was just a fun experience, especially given that show was already so popular amongst the tech community.
And Jeff, what she spoke about that you've always been talking so eloquently about really is, why would you give somebody a once a year review and sort of feel so that they might end up feeling disconnected the rest of the time they're a part of an organization? Absolutely.
And we've long advocated with the New Leadership Challenge and the New Leadership Challenge survey that when our survey is done, employees sit down with their supervisor, not to evaluate their work, but to see in what areas that they could develop to match the organization's leadership ideal. But in the areas where they exceed the large organizational leadership ideal, which is far more than you'd imagine. I mean, like 70% of the areas and people that were tested are actually further along than the ideal the organization hopes to aspire to someday. Those people are asked to take part as a fellow leader in developing others, regardless of where they're at in the organization. And it really, frees up people to think about themselves in new ways, and it changes the tenor of that conversation.
Absolutely.
From going in and talking to my parent to going in and talking to a peer, which is far more, motivating. And I just think that, one of the things that our listeners and viewers should be considering when they're thinking about whether an opportunity is right for you or an organization is something you want to take part in, it's just a question of, are you having fun? Does it sound like it would be a real cool place to work? When I grew up, I was once told that, it's called work because if it was fun, they wouldn't pay you for it. And I just never bought it then, and I don't buy it now. Not when we're spending 8 hours a day, 2,040 hours a year, 80,000 hours of our life over a 40-year span at this thing called work. It better be fun. It better
Yes.
be motivating. You owe it to yourself and to those you work with to be in a place that you feel comfortable with. Otherwise, your discomfort will affect productivity. You're not doing anybody a favor by being in a place that you're not comfortable in.
Absolutely, and it's so true. I love how you explained it, because really what we're talking about is when you go in and have that connection with a peer or ultimately perhaps a supervisor, it's not about what's your work performance as much as you're helping develop leaders, the leader within that all of us possess. So it's exciting that we, as part of Willing to Win, hope that we can help you tap in to that leadership and execute it in your work and home life. What are the takeaways as we think about closing out this mini season on leadership?
Yeah, this has been a blast. It's my favorite topic, so naturally I would like it a lot. But we've been asking you all along, are you a leader? And if so, in what ways do you lead? And if you're not a leader, what ways could you start taking that role? Because everybody should have an opportunity to lead in their lifetime. Today, what we're asking you is, thinking back over what we've done this season, all 4 shows combined, we've come at leadership from many different angles. And I want to ask you, how are you experiencing leadership differently now that you're aware of it? It's sort of like one of those things that once you start noticing it, it's on every block, on every corner, right? So now that you're thinking about leadership, what are your experiences? How are you seeing it and experiencing leadership differently in your life? We'd love to hear from you and potentially even share those insights with our audience on our future show.
Absolutely. Just to recap this season of leadership, we talked initially about simply what leadership is, how do you define it, and then ultimately execute it in your daily life. We then looked at leadership through the ever-changing environment and how exercising it can be challenging as things are inevitably going to shift. Then we looked at access to information. When we consume so much information on a daily basis, how do we channel it for good to really give our strengths to be enhanced by the information that we can amass from those around us and use it for good? And finally, as Jeff said, not only are we going to hope to help ourselves, but the people around us through the execution of this now newfound awareness for some of us to the leadership opportunities that are presenting themselves every day.
Now, before we go, I do have one question. I was thinking about Colleen's title, and if I recall correctly, she is the Chief People, Places, and Publicity Officer. And as Alyssa pointed out to me yesterday, does that make her C-3PO as her title? So I'd be the first.
For all you Star Wars fans, that was such a great reference and witty way that she, evolved Colleen's title to be attached to a blockbuster movie.
If it's
so
not
we
fun,
love it.
Right?
That's right. Work is fun. So thanks so much for joining Willing to Win. Go to our website, willingtowin.org. That's willing2win.org. Follow us on social media. We're all over the place. You can tag us with @Dr. Jeff Kaplan, #W2W Legion, as you become a part of the Willing to Win Legion and join the conversation. Thanks for watching or listening.
These episodes are the first reports filed from the front lines of change, where a growing legion of individuals and organizations are discovering what it takes to win and stay winning in a world defined by change and driven by interconnected human networks.
Willing to Win is produced by Lyft Productions. Guests on the program are not compensated, nor is their appearance representative of the Willing to Win views. Willing to Win does not necessarily endorse any people, products, or services.